Now, this happens in August of 1947, which is exactly the period when both India and Pakistan gained their independence, on the 14th for Pakistan and the 15th for India of August. And on August 15th, Kashmir, which had not yet decided which country it was going to join, had de facto been an independent kingdom.
In the beginning of the story, I would say even going back to the 19th century, late 19th century, there is an element of colonial intrigue. So in a way, the story appears up to a certain point to be that of injustices inflicted on everybody involved in that story. But there is a point in history, you speak about the genocide, where it becomes very clear that the Kashmiri people are the ultimate recipient of the injustice.
Of course, Kashmir has its own context, which not only does it develop as part of the British rule, but also as part of the Dogra rule, which then, of course, the British later on, of course, washed their hands of what happened in Kashmir, despite the fact that the negotiation to partition the subcontinent was one that was largely led by the British.
There's a great deal of affinity that Kashmiris have towards the Palestinians and the Palestinian struggle. And you could maybe help us understand the roots of this affinity, but also the same thing, Palestinians felt towards Kashmir.
There had always been a really interesting connection between the Muslims of South Asia in general and Palestine. And in fact, the Muslim League in India at certain points had announced these days of solidarity or whatever with Palestine, even before the creation of Israel. And the British, had seen this as a possible threat, as a problem. This sort of affinity goes really far back in history. And particularly in the case of Kashmir, I think it's not necessarily only one that emerges from, a certain type of Muslim politics, but later on as well, more sort of left-leaning political figures still see, an analog in Palestine.
Welcome to the FloodGate podcast, brought to you by the Palestine Chronicle. We are here to engage with today's most pressing issues and unpack them beyond the cliches of mainstream media. I am your host, Ramzi Baroud. Today's guest is Abdulla Moaswes. Moaswes is a writer, researcher, educator, and translator. His research interests revolve around global and transnational colonial and anti-colonial connectivities in the majority world, especially in relation to Palestine. His doctoral research outlined and examined the interconnections between Israeli and Indian colonial rule in Palestine and Kashmir, as well as the role of these interconnections within planetary political and economic circulations. In addition to this, Abdullah also writes speculative fiction. Abdullah, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's start with just really trying to understand the very basics of what is happening right now in Kashmir. Could you walk us briefly through the modern history of Kashmir? I know it's a loaded question, but we want our readers to help them unpack these fundamental roots of the conflict as we see it today.
Of course. I think it's really important to start by explaining what is Kashmir and where it is. So typically, when we use the term Kashmir kind of very loosely, we're referring to a region that's to the north of India and to the south of the Xinjiang region in China. And it consists of a few constituent parts that formed what was once called the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. That's the Kashmir Valley, the Jammu region, Ladakh, and Gilgit-Baltistan. Specifically, the Kashmir Valley is a valley that falls to kind of the northeast of what's called the Pir Panjal Range and to the southwest of the sort of lower ranges of the Himalayas. And the way kind of this princely state became constituted was that in 1846, after or during the Second Anglo-Sikh War, the Sikh Empire at the time was forced to forfeit its rule over that region. And the ruler of Jammu, a man called Gulab Singh, the Maharaja Gulab Singh, paid a lump sum of 75 lakhs. 1 lakh is equivalent to around 100,000. So 75 lakhs would be 7.5 million rupees at the time, to the East India Company to gain control over that region. I don't know exactly how much that is equivalent to in today's money, but British politicians from the time refer to it as a paltry sum. So I assume not a lot. And the region kind of, in a sense, becomes almost like the personal fiefdom of Gulab Singh and the subsequent rulers of what they call the Dogra dynasty, who ruled over the region up until 1947. This period is really important. It's characterized by extreme largesse on the behalf of the Dogras, who also kind of instituted a system of land ownership that privileged upper caste Hindu families in the region, and they had banned Muslims from owning land outright. And there were other sort of like policies that had kind of made it difficult for Muslims to practice in the region. So, for example, there were restrictions on like the Adhan and things like that. The British, in a sense, benefited from these policies, but of course, nearly 100 years of living under that sort of rule created certain types of resentment among the Muslims of the region, who were a majority of the population. I think really significantly, something significant to mention here as well is the fact that there were certain instances of depopulation that had also occurred, so people being forced off of their land. A really notable example of this is a region today referred to as Dachigam National Park, which is in Kashmir, in the Kashmir Valley, and this is a national park now that's kind of very similar to American national parks in the sense that it's meant to preserve kind of like the biodiversity and the flora and the fauna of that region. But the name of this national park, Dachigam, is a translation from the phrase for 10 villages, meant to refer to the fact that there were once 10 villages that existed in that region, which were then depopulated and emptied in the early 20th century for the Dogras to use as kind of almost like a personal hunting ground. So coming now more towards kind of like the genus of the current situation, the kind of main catalyst for what was to happen in Kashmir actually started outside of the Kashmir Valley in a region called Poonch. Poonch in the last few days has been the subject of fierce fighting on the line of control between the Indian and Pakistan armies. And what happened here in sort of the spring of 1947 was the sort of undercurrents of what was later going to break out into a full rebellion. As I've explained, by this point, of course, there had been almost 100 years of Dogra rule, very autocratic rule, and a system of rule and a set of policies that had been very clearly designed to privilege one segment and a relatively small segment of the population. And with kind of like the winds of independence and partition arriving, there was an opportunity for change. So over the course of 1947, from the spring onwards into the summer, there's a series of things that go on in Poonch, starting from a tax boycott and then later on evolving into a full-on armed uprising, in which the Pakistan army and the Pakistan state eventually came to play a role. But I should emphasize at this point that this was an uprising against the Dogra dynasty, largely carried out by the people of Poonch and its surrounding regions. What happens eventually is this kind of erupts into an armed uprising, and there is some sort of unofficial involvement of armed groups from Pakistan. Is that the Maharaja, who starts to fear that he may well be overthrown, calls on Jawaharlal Nehru for support. Now, this happens in August of 1947, which is exactly the period. This starts to happen in August of 1947, rather, I should say, which is exactly the period when both India and Pakistan gained their independence on the 14th for Pakistan and the 15th for India of August. And on August 15th, Kashmir, which had not yet decided which country it was going to join, had de facto been an independent kingdom.
Is it, Abdullah, if I may interrupt just for a second here, is it
Mhm,
that the Kashmir at the time, or the ruler, the prince, the
mhm.
Maharaja of Kashmir, didn't decide, or was it that he had a completely different plan? Instead of joining Pakistan or
So,
India, he actually wanted to become an independent country of his own, more or less.
so I'll kind of outline how partition worked broadly and then come to this answer.
Absolutely.
The agreement, of course, was that Muslim majority regions under what was then British India would form Pakistan. That was largely Punjab and or half of Punjab at least, 2/3 of it, and the proportion of Bengal, which later became Bangladesh in 1971. And then there were these regions that were called princely states, that were regions that were not directly ruled by the British, but rather were ruled through like a local monarch.
Mhm.
In most cases, the monarch followed the same religion as the majority of the population, with a few exceptions. And Kashmir, of course, is the most notable of that, where you have a Muslim majority population and a Hindu king. Um, the other two notable exceptions were the opposite, where you had a Hindu majority population and a Muslim king. And those regions were Junagadh, which is in today in Gujarat in India, and Hyderabad, which is in the south of India in a state called Telangana, where you had a Muslim king and Hindu subjects, Hindu population. Um, Both of these regions eventually went to India under extreme duress. But there are historians who argue that India was prepared to give up on Junagadh to set a precedent whereby they would gain Kashmir, in the sense that the leader, the king who was of the minority religion, would decide to join the state that their religion followed. So the Muslim king of Junagadh would join with Pakistan. But of course, there was also an uprising in Junagadh that eventually India also capitalized on, and they were able to take control of that region. And then, of course, there's a whole wealth of literature on what happened in Hyderabad as well. In the case of Kashmir, it was unclear what was going to happen. There was a delay, of course, in what the king was going to decide. And from what we understand, he was forced to sign something called the Instrument of Accession in exchange for Indian support in holding on to the region. And that instrument effectively was the legal document that allowed India to stake a claim to Kashmir.
Just to clarify, Abdullah, he was asked to sign that document by India, as
By
opposed
India,
to
yes.
by India itself. Okay.
Yeah. So he
Okay.
had requested support from the Indian government and army to kind of protect his position in what was at this point still the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. And in exchange, he was made to sign something called the Instrument of Accession. The
Yes.
Indian army went in alongside other armed groups such as the RSS, which maybe we'll come to later. And there was a war that lasted roughly just over a year. And there was also a big genocide that was committed in Jammu itself, where the Muslim population decreased from 60% to becoming a minority.
And
Um,
is this genocide, because there is an element here? Okay, so
mhm,
in the beginning of the story,
mhm.
I would say, even going back to the 19th century, mid late 19th century, there is an element of colonial intrigue. This is
Yeah.
just because
Mhm,
all of the subcontinent was colonized by the British.
mhm. Yeah.
Divide and rule, the British
Mhm,
doing what the British do.
mhm.
Uh, Both Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, everybody involved were subjects, and they were
Yes.
colonized, humiliated,
Mhm, mhm,
subjected to all sorts of violence and exploitations, and quite often famines as
mhm,
well. So, in a way, the story appears up to a certain point to be that of
mhm,
injustices inflicted on
mhm.
everybody involved in
Yes.
that story. But there is a point in history, you speak about the genocide, where it
Mhm,
becomes very clear that the Kashmiri people are the ultimate recipient of the injustice. What are the roots of the injustice that is felt so deeply by Kashmiris right now? Does it come from India, or does it come from this historical contradictions created by the British?
I mean, the British certainly created the conditions for what now we call communalism in the entirety of the subcontinent. Um, and this allowed certain interests to form that had vested interests in maintaining kind of like this notion of majorities and minorities. Of course, there's a body of literature that argues that this is the case for every state in the world, but of course, the Indian case is particularly striking. There is also, I should mention, like there's a change in the mode of British rule in India before 1857 and after, where primarily the British had favored, kind of like the Muslim population, in the sense that they were previously the political elite in many parts of the region. But this changes after 1857, when there is an attempt at an armed uprising against what was then the East India Company, who had kind of ruled India indirectly through manipulating commerce and trade and its kind of like private militias that had been involved in that. After 1857, Britain takes an approach of trying to better understand the demographics of the region in a way where it would allow them to play this game of divide and rule. And certainly in the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, which of course was not under direct British rule, it was a princely state. They had still favored kind of like enabling the Dogra dynasty to do what it had done. There was not really much pushback against that from the side of the British. And so this then, allows within the entirety of the subcontinent, a certain type of politics, a certain type of Islamophobic politics to develop. But of course, Kashmir has its own context, which is that not only not only does it develop as part of the British rule, but also as part of the Dogra rule. Which then, of course, the British later on, of course, washed their hands of like what happened in Kashmir, despite the fact that the negotiation to partition the subcontinent was one that was largely led by the British. And in the end, actually, the outcome was the one that Britain favored, because I think no side was actually happy with the partition agreement, neither the Pakistani side, so the Muslim League, nor Congress, but the British were happy with it. But that's not to say that like there were not elements within India that had the agency to avoid allowing this sort of Islamophobia to fester. And so it's kind of a combination of both of these things. And at certain points in history, India stops being like the possibility of an independent India under the Congress party stops being seen as one where they will protect the rights of certain minorities. And key among them, of course, are Muslims. And the other key minority to mention here are people who are caste oppressed. So Dalits and Adivasis, for example.
So are you essentially saying that what is happening in Kashmir is a microcosm of a bigger conflict that was never really resolved since the partition of India in 1947? Or is it really just about Kashmir?
It's kind of both. Of course, like the main driving force of the alienation of specifically Kashmiris does happen to be the fact that, they did eventually come to constitute the only Muslim majority state within the Indian Union. And so that's a major part of it. And of course, India had its own kind of issues with Muslim agency and Muslim politics within, the mainland of the subcontinent as well. But there is also a particularity about Kashmir, which is that, like there for a very long time, there wasn't, like a shared sense of Muslim consciousness between Muslims in mainland India and in Kashmir. And the main reason for this being that the Congress party were very skillful in sort of, using the rhetoric of a specific Indian type of secularism to try and project an image of like an Indian state that was accommodating to this sort of religious diversity, when a lot of its policies indicated that actually it wasn't. But unlike the Muslims of Kashmir, the Muslims of mainland India are rooted in their land that for a long time had been known and recognized to be India. Whereas Kashmir became completely cut off from other regions that it had historically traded with. Historically, its trade routes went to Central Asia and, to China and to kind of like the territories that later came to constitute Pakistan, that it all became cut off from. And from the beginning, it had, certain Kashmiri political parties and leaders had aspirations towards, autonomy or independence, or to join Pakistan entirely and not to be part of India at all. And so it's kind of both, in the sense that it does fit within a wider context of like Indian Islamophobia, but it also has its very particular place within that.
Okay, and that Islamophobia kind of took on a whole different dimension after the Indians' embrace of the BJP
Mm-hmm.
party and the rise of Modi. And we're going to talk about this here in a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But just one final clarifying question for
Sure.
our readers, our viewers, when they look at a map and they
Mm-hmm.
would kind of see this, you know, majority of Kashmir more or less is in Indian hands or under
Mm-hmm.
Indian control.
Yes.
Slightly smaller part under Pakistani control.
Mm-hmm.
A part of Kashmir is actually under Chinese control,
Yes, and that's a really
and
interesting story in and of itself.
that's an interesting story. And then you have Kashmir or Azad Kashmir, which is like a whole different thing going on
Mm-hmm.
here on the side.
Mm-hmm.
If you
And you have
could briefly
Gilgit-Baltistan, of course, which also was
say,
part of the princely state, but nowadays
so
has a completely separate status.
oh, exactly. So I know it's a challenging task, but just for the sake of time, if you could
Sure.
briefly just help us understand how did these borders,
Mm-hmm.
were shaped? What war
Yeah.
resulted in these particular borders?
So in 1947, in the later part of the year, as I had mentioned, when there was this armed uprising that started out in Punch. Punch today, by the way, falls right on the line of control. So it's right in between. In fact, the former district of Punch, I think, was divided between the Pakistani side and the Indian side. Um, once the Indian army gets formally involved, the Pakistani army also formally enters the fray, and they fight a war that lasts, from the later part of 1947 up until the later part of 1948. With kind of a UN mediated agreement coming into effect at the beginning of 1949. And that agreement kind of solidified this borderline that today we call the line of control, which had been de facto kind of like the region, that the line that had separated the parts of Kashmir that the Indian army held and the parts that kind of like the rebels from Punch and later on the Pakistan army had held. And it had kind of, as part of the UN agreement, it became kind of like this de facto ceasefire line, which later on became the line of control as part of a different agreement in the 1970s. But that line has more or less not changed significantly since then. And according to that line, what was west of that line ended up west, and kind of to the north of that line ended up falling under Pakistani control. And what was to the east of it and the south of the top part of the line fell under Indian control, which you can generally say, yes, the Pakistani side, which its residents today refer to as Azad Kashmir, includes, mainly the cities of Mirpur, Muzaffarabad, and Kotli and Rawalakot, and of course Gilgit-Baltistan, which had been as I said, part of the princely state, but not officially part of Azad Kashmir, but it is under Pakistani rule at the moment. And then the Indian side had kept most of the Kashmir Valley, a large part of the Jammu region, and Ladakh, which formed up until 2019 the what was then called the state of Jammu and Kashmir under Indian rule. Nowadays, there's no longer a state there. There's what you call two union territories that were sort of outlined and bifurcated from the original state of Jammu and Kashmir in 2019. Jammu and Kashmir is now a union territory ruled directly from Delhi, and Ladakh is a union territory ruled directly from Delhi.
Mhm. And where do the Chinese come into this
So the
power play?
Chinese entered the story later in the 1960s. or late 50s even. Like a lot of occupying powers. So, of course, both of us know the story of Israel. The question of exactly where the borders fell was a bit of a nebulous one, of course, because no state wants to declare that they don't control, the land that they de facto don't control, right? Um, and so China, having incorporated East Turkestan, Xinjiang into its body, and Tibet as well, had sought to build a road between them. And that road passed through part at the time of Ladakh. So with the borders not having been declared, China goes ahead and builds this road, which becomes the impetus for a war between India and China in the early 60s as well. And this is interestingly also a point at which Israel enters the fray, because Nehru requests military support from Israel. He requests munitions and weapons to be sent over in order to give him the upper hand against China. And at the time, he had requested from Ben Gurion to not put the Israeli flag on the shipments of arms that were going to India, and Ben Gurion, of course, refused. But eventually, Nehru conceded to Ben Gurion. The shipment arrived, and India had used the weapons in order to, again, kind of consolidate a certain de facto ceasefire line on that side. But what's also really interesting about what goes on here is also kind of like the language of the communication between Nehru and David Ben Gurion, where both of them kind of talk about how they're both states striving for peace, who have never invaded another land before, when, of course, ironically, they are talking about an occupied land.
No, this is interesting, and I'm sure that a lot of people are not aware of this, because Nehru is kind of in general kind of seen more or less as more amiable and progressive, and he was close friends to various Arab countries and governments, and therefore he's when we think of this kind of new face of India, very aggressive, very colonial, very quite racist and Islamophobic, as presented by Modi, we don't associate that with Nehru. These are in a sense, the good old days. But wait a minute, that wasn't at all the case. India was involved in communication with Israel from the very start. Now, why was Ben Gurion interested? I mean, we're talking about very, very early on here in the foundation of the State of Israel. Why did they have this kind of geopolitical outreach that they found India and China to be an interesting place instead of fortifying their own colonial rule over the Palestinians? And why did Nehru seek Israel in particular? I mean, he must have had other options.
So, interestingly, I mean, Israel pursued very early on a policy called the periphery doctrine in their foreign policy, which was, of course, they had known that a lot of the Arab states were not amenable to having normal or even, good, not normal relations with Israel. But they sought to kind of look for powerful states on the periphery. So this included, for example, Turkey, at the time Iran, India, Ethiopia, to kind of give them a little bit of, support within the wider region. And I mean, Israel reached out to India actually quite early in the day, when it comes to when both states had kind of declared their independence within about 1 year of each other. But interestingly, a lot of Israel's attempts to kind of, gain formal recognition from India were hampered by the situation in Kashmir. So India's representatives in the US and at the UN at that point included Nehru's sister, and she had, had communications and correspondences with Israel's representatives in the US and at the UN. And the line was that India cannot recognize Israel until until the Kashmir question is settled. A lot of historians have kind of hypothesized that the likely reason for this is that India had tried to, adopt to adopt a pro-Palestine stance publicly in order to gain the favor of like the Arab states at the time, and to kind of discourage them or to give them an opportunity to not side with Pakistan on the issue of Kashmir. So from the very beginning, the issues of Palestine and Kashmir become connected through the fact that they kind of emerge at the same historical juncture, and India knows very well that like in order to hold on to Kashmir, they do need the support of these Arab countries. Um, and so this is why like we later on start to become very educated about like this very pro-Palestine stance that India had adopted from very early on. Of course, the other reason for that pro-Palestine stance is the fact that India, having been opposed to its own partition, could not support the partition of another region, and so they had long been looking for the possibility of a one-state outcome. Which was, of course, contrary to kind of like the international consensus at that point in time in Palestine. So eventually, India does come to recognize Israel in 1950, and then there's an embassy opened up an Israeli embassy opened up in Bombay shortly afterwards. And what's really interesting is that both India and Pakistan and Israel all derive their absentee property laws or evacuee property laws in the case of South Asia from a British piece of legislation called the Trading with the Enemies Act. And there are historians who also suggest that part of how this was done was through correspondence between particularly India and Israel. So for those who don't know, I mean, in the case of Palestine, the absentee property law is that is the legal instrument that allowed Israel to expropriate the properties of Palestinians who had been forced out of their homes. And then, of course, in South Asia, you had a similar situation where a lot of people had migrated from India to Pakistan or vice versa, leaving behind empty properties that then the state took the
I
opportunity
think
to
it's particularly interesting that the Israelis were a connection to the British Empire or the British rule in
Mhm.
Palestine. I mean, they were planted there, the Balfour
Yes.
Declaration, and therefore having the Israelis taking points from the British playbook kind of seems colonial playbook. That is, it seems very rational. But
Mhm.
the countries that have themselves being subjected
Mhm.
by British colonial rules using British laws to actually forge their own rules that have kind of unjustly
Mhm.
dispossessed people, large
Mhm.
communities. That's quite interesting, and to see that actually Pakistan, India, and Israel all have that in
Yeah.
common. I mean, that's quite fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I think it is really fascinating. And then when it comes to like Nehru, for example, and his pro-Palestine credentials, I mean, there is significant evidence to suggest that like he had very different views in private, and sometimes these filtered into Indian policy. So, for example, I'll read you this quote. So Moshe Yeager was one of the really important diplomats up until the 90s, but who had kind of like served as a go-between between countries in Asia generally and Israel. And he wrote a book in Hebrew about Israel's relationship with India, and in it he quotes Nehru speaking with Yigal Allon during a visit by Allon to India in 1959. And Nehru says, and here I'm quoting, although I must say that this quote is my translation from an Arabic translation of the Hebrew translation from Moshe Yeager's book. I imagine the original quote was in English, but it may not be exactly the same wording as this translation I have here. So Nehru says, I acknowledge that I in the past did not recognize Zionism. Rather, I saw in it as an operation of stealing the land from the Arabs and their illegal expulsion from the lands in which they lived. I believed that Palestine needed to remain Arab, but I have changed my view. The disaster faced by the Jews in Europe and the amazing project of state building have convinced me that Israel must be established as a Jewish state and that Israel must remain because its existence is a fact and it is a member in the United Nations and because it is the right of the Jews to have a state of their own. And later on, he
Do
is
you
also
think?
quoted
Do you
saying that Israel is a fact and he's not one to deny facts and that he doesn't believe it's a negative fact.
Do you think that this quote can be trusted? I'm not trying to defend Nehru in any way, but I'm just saying
Mhm.
from in terms of historical analysis and especially discourse analysis, is this something that is consistent with the language and political discourse of Nehru in general?
I mean, even if we want to disregard this quote, which I'm not sure I would do, but even if we were to take that position, we can look at the case of the Bandung Conference
Mhm.
in the mid 50s, where there was a big question mark, of course, over the role of Israel in the conference and whether Israel could be included in this conference. Um, the historical record does say that actually the country that had strongly lobbied for Israel's inclusion in the Bandung Conference was India, India alongside Burma. And of course, the objection had come from Egypt, Pakistan, and Indonesia. So these were three really powerful states, particularly Egypt and Indonesia, in the context of the Bandung Conference.
So it is somewhat consistent, really, with the behavior of India, not just that specific
Yeah,
quote
I
or other
think so.
quotes.
Yeah, I mean, there is good enough evidence to say that like Nehru had, like as I said, that this had leaked into Indian policy on Israel. So of course, India plays like a really delicate game, right? Between trying to have this public championing of the Palestinian cause, it's really important for India's relations with West Asia generally, but also with India's relations with its own Muslim population internally. But then also,
Which
like India's desire to have relations with Israel, which of course constitute a part of the very tricky like communal dynamic that they're trying to play.
which is, of course, a position that was taken by other, of course, many Arab governments,
Hmm.
until normalization. I mean, there was you kind of see this kind of soft normalization happening
Hmm.
behind closed doors, secretive meetings and the sort, and yet publicly they will take the strongest possible
Yes.
stance at the United Nations and other international
Hmm.
institutions. No
Hmm.
wonder why Palestinians have finally decided to take matters into their own hands, but that's
Yes.
for another
Yeah.
conversation.
And actually,
Now,
if I can just continue on the issue of Bandung, so of course we know and Israel did not play a role in the Bandung conference, but India did lobby very hard to water down a lot of the outcomes of the conference that were related to Palestine. So, like it's not only that they had lobbied for Israel's inclusion, because one could then say, oh, perhaps that's because they want to hear different sides. And, like there is a certain line of foreign policy thinking that suggests that even if you disagree with them, you should have them present or whatever. But even within the conference itself, like India plays a role that is not all that conducive to championing the Palestinian cause.
mm, okay. So so now Palestine enters into this. I mean, we know when Israel more or less kind of became part of the politics of the former subcontinent and later India, Pakistan, Kashmir, and other related issues. But how did the Palestinians factor into this? Because and let me just say a bit of a background here. There's a great deal of affinity that Kashmiris have towards the Palestinians and the
Mhm.
Palestinian struggle. And you could maybe help us understand the roots of this affinity, but also the same thing, Palestinians felt towards Kashmir. I mean, I grew up in a refugee camp in the Gaza Strip, and I used to go to this mosque in the Nusayrat refugee camp since I was a little kid, and I used to always see images of um, uh, Chechen victims to the Russians, and Palestinian victims, Lebanese, and always the Kashmiris are kind of present in that kind of display of kind of larger victimhood, if you will,
Mhm.
of people in the Muslim Ummah. So Kashmir does factor in Palestinian thinking as well. Does this go back to a specific ideology, to an event, or it's something that organically just grew out of the similarities between both scenarios?
Again, it's kind of a combination of both. There had always been like a really interesting connection between the Muslims of South Asia in general and Palestine, even predating like the emergence of India as a state or Israel as a state. Um, there had been, for example, like in the early days after the end of the Ottoman Empire, a series of like what they called like Islamic conferences or congresses that happened in Cairo and Jerusalem and Damascus. to kind of talk about the issues that had been, affecting the Muslims at the time. And Indian Muslims were strongly represented in a lot of those conferences. In fact, one of the leaders of the Khilafah movement from India is actually buried like in the old city of Jerusalem. To kind of, I guess his grave kind of sits there as testament to the fact that there had always been this historical connection. Like Palestine had always been a really important issue within kind of Muslim consciousness in general, not just in the Arab countries or in the Muslim countries, but among Muslims everywhere, effectively. And in fact, like the Muslim League in India at certain points had like announced these like days of solidarity or whatever with Palestine, even before the creation of Israel. And the British, had seen this as a possible threat, as a problem. And that's represented in like debates that you can read in the records of the British Parliament. And so there had always been this sort of connection. And of course, like some of, the really important leaders of like Muslim politics in India had, like a special interest in Kashmir. So for example, like Muhammad Iqbal, the poet, philosopher, polymath, who usually is referred to in Persian as Iqbal Lahori from Lahore, actually originally is from Kashmir. And he had a special interest in both cases. So, this sort of affinity goes really far back in history. And particularly in the case of Kashmir, I think it's not necessarily only one that emerges from, like a certain type of Muslim politics, but later on as well, more sort of like left-leaning political figures still see, like an analog in Palestine. So Maqbul Bhat, for example, in the 1960s, talks about this sort of, comparison between the role of the Jordanian state with regards to Palestinian liberation and the Pakistani state with regards to Kashmiri liberation. And so, there are a lot of points that kind of come together to create like this image of strong parallels between Kashmir and Palestine. And so, of course, it's important, obviously, to not kind of like flatten them out and say, oh, they're the same. But of course, Kashmiris can see themselves in Palestine. And I think Palestinians who are aware and conscious of the situation of Kashmir can see themselves in that as well. That's certainly, I mean, what drew me to address, as a Palestinian researcher, to address this topic. And later on, of course, like the term Free Palestine almost becomes like a substitute for like the term Free Kashmir, because of course the Indian army later on banned this phrase from being painted on walls and used in public settings. And so in a sense, Palestine and Kashmir become almost the same thing in the minds of Kashmiris. So there is a really special relationship there that goes very deep and is not only rooted in, like Muslim politics, but also in like Kashmir's own intellectual production.
And the Indian government knows that very well. Just a little side note: a newspaper, the main newspaper in Kashmir under the Indian rule, was actually shut down. One of the main reasons, before it was brought back to circulation, one of the main reasons cited by the Indian authorities is that they published my articles. One of the three main reasons. And it just took me by a complete surprise. Like, why would the Indian authority be so interested in making sure that a Kashmir newspaper does not publish a Palestinians? I'm still somewhat puzzled, but not as puzzled as I was when I saw that in the news. But the point here is that while the Kashmiris have this long kind of this complex relationship with Palestinians, it's not a knee-jerk reaction to because we are Muslims and they are Hindus and the Zionists are taking it's more complex than that. But on the Indian side, the Hindu side in particular, rather, why is this anti-Palestinian sentiment that is so powerful and is relentless to the point that it seems that Israel has leased part of its propaganda war to to Hindu nationalists who are, kind of taking this anti-Palestinian stance, despite the fact that there has never been a historical conflict between the Palestinians and the Indians, Hindus or otherwise. but they are so invested in this anti-Palestinian sentiment. Why do you think that's the case?
Yeah, this is a really important question. And again, like this goes back really far in history. So when the Hindu nationalist movement emerges at the beginning, in the early part of the 20th century, as being like a credible political current within India, they developed like this entire ideology of like what it means to be a Hindu. And that's not necessarily one that a lot of Hindus necessarily follow, because it's not really a religious doctrine, but it's a political um, view of what it means to be a Hindu. So one of the leading, figures or founding fathers of the Hindu nationalist movement, a man called Veer Savarkar, was himself actually an atheist. So in a sense, there is a comparison with the emergence of Zionism here.
Mhm.
But he defines a Hindu as somebody whose homeland is India and whose like holy land is also India. In fact, he uses the term fatherland specifically, and this is in a way later on becomes a really interesting like mirroring of like the discourse of fascists in Europe. And there were certainly connections between like the early Hindu nationalists and European fascists in Italy and in Germany. Um, this idea later, develops, into this notion of what another leader later on of the RSS. So the RSS is the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh. So it's a mouthful, and was very difficult for me to learn how to say as not a native Hindi speaker. Um, it's this like paramilitary organization, a paramilitary volunteer organization that forms part of what they call the family of organizations, the Sangh Parivar. Um, so one of their earlier leaders, as I said, was this man called M.S. Golwalkar, and he kind of defined like the concept of what a nation should be by what he called five unities. Geographical unity would be basically being a country, racial unity, religious unity, cultural unity, and linguistic unity. And he regarded that there were, aside from Hindus in India, like there were two key examples of this in the world. One, of course, being the Nazis in Germany, and the other one being the Zionists, should they achieve a state on their historical homeland, which in his case meant Palestine. Um, and so, there were these connections started out very early. So,
But it's just brilliant that that kind of pro-Nazi sentiment or
Mhm.
ideological allegiance, if you will, so what a lot of people insisted until the genocide in Gaza not to see. Even
Mhm.
within our movement, you find some resentment of people trying to describe the Zionists as Nazis, and yet
Yeah.
they themselves in India, the Hindu nationalists, have actually kind of modeled themselves around both movements.
Yeah, I mean, I remember seeing a while ago, a few years ago, at this point, at the early on in my PhD, a tweet from like an anonymous account in India that had the text of it was something that was very pro India and very Islamophobic. Sorry, very pro Israel. I must say the account was an Indian account. The text was very pro Israel, but the profile picture was Hitler. And so, so I mean, at this point, like, there's not much you can do aside from laugh at the irony of it. But yeah,
Right.
I
In
mean,
fact,
the Hindu
I
nationalists had themselves drawn this comparison between the Zionists and the
absolutely, and
Nazis.
don't quote me on this, but I do recall, and perhaps our producer can include that in an image of that a newspaper article that actually indicated that a good number of years ago, one of the most read books in India were Hitler's My Struggle,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
there has to be a reason behind this. This is just not a random occurrence.
yeah. I mean, the Hindu nationalist movement had taken a lot of inspiration from the Nazis, and I would say even more so from the Italian fascists.
Mhm.
Um, but particularly the thing that kind of draws them in with the Zionists, aside from the fact that they see this sort of like parallels or congruences with this idea of like the Holy Land and the Fatherland and these five unities or whatever, is also just plain Islamophobia. So, for example, like Savarkar writes at one point that oh, if there were to be a war between, India and Pakistan, all the Muslims would support Pakistan, and therefore we should support Israel. Um, and so, that also plays into it. And there's a lot of criticism of this concept until today, actually, and for much of the 20th century. One of the main pillars of like Hindu nationalist political rhetoric was this concept of Muslim appeasement. That, oh, the Muslims are a minority in India and we shouldn't have to appease them. We shouldn't, like have a pro-Palestine foreign policy because it's detrimental to India, but we do it just to appease the Muslims, who, shouldn't have so much agency in our country. And it becomes like it's a very insidious sort of like line of politics. There's a really interesting quote from like a Muslim Indian filmmaker from 1939, who says, and again here I'm quoting this man called Khwaja Ahmed Abbas. He says, the cleverest trump card played by the Nazis in India, as in other Muslim countries, is the Palestine issue. The Muslims of India naturally have strong sympathies for the Arabs, and the Nazi agents have cleverly exploited this to create anti-Jewish sentiment, which was hitherto not very prominent. And so these things all kind of come into play at the same time, historically, and the Hindu nationalists see an opportunity to develop alliances and even contradictory alliances.
Right. So that takes me, if I may just add this little caveat here. How did the Palestinians navigate this? Because this, from a political point of view, it seems a very, very difficult situation to navigate politically. I know that some intellectuals and activists in Kashmir are puzzled by Yasar Arafat, the former head of, or the late head of the PLO, and his position that was quite friendly with India, until, of course, the rise of the PGP and all of that. But he had, this famous meeting with Indira Gandhi, in which he refers to her as my sister. And it's really, I mean, my writings, what where I stand on many of these historical events and my position towards Yasser Arafat. So I am not really trying to kind of give any excuse to Arafat or to anybody else. But considering everything that you have said, how does a leader of a political organization that is operating from someone else's territories have very little resources, very little even physical presence in many of these countries in the Arab world, is able to actually navigate a complex situation like India? Should Arafat be blamed if, from a historical point of view, of trying to win India to his side, at least diplomatically?
I mean, something I should probably start with, which I suppose maybe in the course of my answer may come across as me contradicting myself, is that hindsight, is very beneficial. What did they say? Hindsight is 2020, right? And so, of course, in the context of like Hindu nationalism, at the point in which Arafat starts to develop these relations with Indira Gandhi, like the Hindu nationalists are largely in opposition in India, and now we know that Indira Gandhi did actually mandate India's research and analysis wing, so that's their foreign intelligence agency, to develop a secret backline with the Mossad. But that wasn't public knowledge at that point in time. So that's one side of it. At this point, obviously India had publicly professed a very strong position of support for Palestine. And to the point where Yasser Arafat actually even offers to campaign for Indira Gandhi among Muslims in India. It's not an offer that she accepted, but one that is on the record nonetheless from a senior Indian diplomat. Now, on the other side of things, I mean, there were criticisms for a very long time of Yasser Arafat and what they called unprincipled alliances. The Syrian writer Sadiq al-Azm very famously wrote that piece entitled Palestinian Zionism, where he kind of talks about the attempts of Yasser Arafat to develop alliances with like states, organizations, entities that possibly damaged the cause because of the fact that they may have been strategically beneficial, but in the longer term of things, morally problematic. And I think that the court is out on this one. I personally take the opinion that I do think that Arafat um, didn't necessarily center morals in his foreign policy approach, and didn't center like an ethic of anti-colonialism against states within the global South. So, for example, like one of the famous cases, aside from India and Kashmir, is Iraq and the Kurds under Saddam. And I think that that's consistent with a lot of his, sort of foreign policy decisions for a very long time. Um, and so, I mean, I think possibly there was a gap in knowledge with regarding what was going on in Kashmir that India had very successfully cultivated by taking that decision from day one to link its support for Palestine with intentionally obscuring, like the case of Kashmir. But I mean, I'm ready to take into account, all of the difficulties that Arafat faced, but I'm not ready to let him off the hook for it.
Absolutely. It's just
Like
the dichotomy of politics. I mean, the
foreign
fact that
policy decisions.
Nelson Mandela himself, I mean, once you are in a position of power and
Hmm.
you are now stately and you have to act accordingly, then it becomes a balancing act. On one
Yes.
hand, he would not ditch Arafat or Castro or Muammar
Hmm.
Gaddafi, but on the other hand, he shook hands with some of the most notorious, violators of human rights.
Yeah.
So it's not something really unique to Arafat or to the Palestinians.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, those in opposition, like Palestinian socialist movements, particularly the PFLP
Hmm.
and other Marxist movements, have always kind of favored the moral,
Hmm. Yeah.
anti-colonial side, wholeheartedly embraced it, as opposed to the more diplomatic and mainstream
Yeah.
political choices.
I
But I
mean,
think this
again,
is very
benefit of
good.
hindsight. Sorry to cut you off, but yeah, again, with the benefit of hindsight, like now we can say that, okay, these unprincipled alliances were ultimately not very beneficial in the longer term. Of course, in the short term, there were gains to be made here and there, but in the long term, we can now make that argument. But I mean, of course, in the 1970s, um, like it may have been more difficult to make this argument, but like I said, I still feel that it must have certainly been a stronger consideration.
Now, India is very clear now where it stands politically. There's no hiding anymore.
Hmm.
No secret documents are required. No, quotes translated through other languages is prerequisite to understanding that the Indian government, under this kind of Hindu nationalist movement, stands squarely on the Israeli side.
Hmm.
And that kind of really further highlights the position of the Palestinians, or what should have been a clear position for Palestinians. But do you feel like it is clear for the Palestinian Authority and the current leadership? Are they acting accordingly, according to this new knowledge?
I think in large part they're trying to continue the foreign policy line that was set by Arafat. So I mean, in was it in 2018 or in 2019? The Palestinian Authority had awarded Modi like the highest civilian honor in Palestine, and a few years earlier, I believe in 2018, going into early 2019, they had also withdrawn their ambassador from Pakistan on the request of the Indian government. And so, I think for a long time, the PLO and then later on the Palestinian Authority played a very delicate game of being one of the few states in the world that had good relations with India and Pakistan. But in the recent sort of decade, it's become very clear that the Palestinian leadership, or at least the PA leadership, has been trying really hard to kind of like conserve or salvage like elements of its former relationship with India that are, I think, frankly naive to think of as being salvageable. Like the order to withdraw the ambassador, as far as I know, or at least I'm led to believe, came from Mahmoud Abbas himself, and was contrary to the advice of many. And part of the reasoning for this was the fact that India and Israel were about to sign, like, the biggest arms deal that Israel had ever signed in its history, later on to be surpassed by a deal with Germany. But nonetheless, they had signed this deal to about the tune of about 2 billion, dollars of Indian purchases of Israeli arms. And nowadays we've reached a point where actually, both states are manufacturing, weapons in each other's countries. So, we know that a lot of the drones that flew over Gaza in the last, 18 months were manufactured in India. And
If you could just elaborate on that a little bit more, Abdullah,
sure.
I think our readers or our viewers will be more interested, or rather very interested in knowing India's direct
Mhm.
collaboration with Israel and contribution to
Yeah.
the genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, like as I said, part of the security relationship between India and Israel begins in the late 60s, like after the Six-Day War in 1967, when Indira Gandhi instructs a man called R.N. Kao, who was the leader, who was a senior official in the research and analysis wing, which usually is referred to as RAW, to form a relationship with the Mossad, like a back channel. And this back channel gets used, to address certain matters over the ensuing decades, and survives Indira Gandhi's rule. So she eventually becomes assassinated, but this back channel still existed for a long time. And in the 90s, after India and Israel had formally recognized like one another and had established normal relations in the early part of the decade, there's sort of gentle, or not gentle is a bad word in this case, but a sort of beginning of a trickle of like a flow of arms between the two states. India successfully tests a nuclear weapon at a certain point, and the US, in line with what was called the Glenn Amendment, places sanctions on providing arms to India. Of course, at this point, the Soviet Union, which was India's largest supplier of arms, had fallen. And in order to access like American grade or American quality of weapons without having to go through the US because of the Glenn Amendment, Israel becomes an option as a really powerful trading partner in the field of military technology and defense. Initially, India is careful to kind of go into this, head first, because they view Israel as being like a rival to their own indigenous development. But in 1999, after the outbreak of the Kargil War, which again happens in Kashmir on the line of control, in a place called Kargil, the Indian army becomes exposed due to its lack of being, able and trained to fight in these like really high altitude settings. Of course, we're talking about some of the highest altitudes in the world here. And so they request support from Israel, which arrives in the shape of certain types of munitions in terms of satellite imaging, intelligence gathering. And they start to see that, it may be worth actually trying to become, to develop military technology with Israel rather than in opposition to them, rather than as a competitor. And so over the course of the decades that follow that, you start to see a lot of Israeli technology being purchased and used in Kashmir, on like the line of control, for example, surveillance technology, small munitions, things like that. And coming into like the rule of Modi institutes a policy called Make in India. It was his big flagship policy in 2014, and I think a lot of economists regard it as largely being a failure. The idea being that India wants to expand its manufacturing base. India, by the way, considering that it's such a large country, is not super efficient in manufacturing. A lot of the people who work in manufacturing in India, or Indians who work in manufacturing, work abroad. And the element of domestic manufacturing that makes up that has its proportion of its economy is smaller than compared to, say, the role of domestic manufacturing in other places like even Bangladesh or China, to use kind of like a scale, an example that's of a similar scale of country. But the one area where they are somewhat successful is in arms manufacturing, and Israel starts to see that, okay, in India they have a larger base of potential, like labor for factories, people who can be involved in the technological side, the coding, all of the software development for the arms. India has like these, sort of tech hubs, and particularly in Bangalore, for example, that Israel sees as possibly being advantageous. And so deals start to become signed between different, Israeli manufacturers and Indian conglomerates for the most part. So there's a partnership, for example, between the Adani Group, which is one of the really big, conglomerates, big corporations in India, and Elbit Systems, which is an Israeli arms manufacturer. And in fact, like I was just about to say, today, or rather yesterday in the evening, we received news that some of the drones that were flying over Pakistan were actually manufactured by Israel Aerospace Industries, which is I think the state-owned manufacturer. And kind of going the opposite way, of course, at the early days of the escalated genocide after October 7, 2023, Israel starts having a need to replenish its stocks really quickly. And so they, start to accelerate production in India, and a lot of like the sort of, co-manufactured technologies and weapons start being transferred physically from India to Israel to be used in Gaza. So one of the most significant of these, for example, is the Hermes drones, which are manufactured largely these days in India, but by an Israeli company in collaboration with an Indian company.
There's been a lot of attempts to hold Western companies or Western governments accountable for weapons that have been supplied to Israel and used directly in the genocide or in the occupation of Palestine. Do you know, to your knowledge, has there been any attempt at holding the Indian government accountable for kind of feeding the Israeli genocide in Gaza?
I mean, India has largely suppressed pro-Palestine protests in the last 18 months. It's been very difficult to conduct on the ground, any sort of like pro-Palestine, anti-Israel activism. Not just in Kashmir, where they've been outright banned, but even in the mainland, there have been a lot of arrests in a lot of the major cities in India, where there were attempts at having pro-Palestine demonstrations and actions. So, I mean, there is a branch of the BDS movement in India, which is active there. But I mean, obviously, they're working under horrendously difficult constraints in the context of India. But I should say, the outside of India, the groups that have been involved in direct action against, like Israeli manufacturers. So, for example, I live here in the UK, and we have, like Elbit Systems has a factory here in the UK, and they've been targeted by, a group called Palestine Action. Palestine Action have very explicitly in a lot of their media regarding their actions mentioned the fact that, Elbit is also involved in, the colonization of Kashmir as well as Palestine.
So it's good to see that there is that kind of, on the Palestinian side. I know Palestinians and the pro-Palestine camp is extremely kind of consumed by the genocide in Gaza, and how can you not be consumed with that and have any other priorities? But it seems that there is a growing awareness that Kashmir has to be included, if not even eventually central, to the intersectional solidarity movement around Palestine. And I think, as we discussed, if in the 60s and 70s there were reasons maybe to believe that maybe the PLO needed to kind of strike that balancing act, there is no need for that anymore. But of course, you also have that government, the Palestinian Authority, which is, and I'm sure a lot of Kashmiris and people around the world already know this, that the PA does not represent the Palestinian people
Yes, of
in any
course.
way, and they are actively working with Israel to subdue the very resistance in Palestine. Is there anything else that you would like to add, Abdullah? I know we have exceeded the allocated time, but just in case, there are a couple of points that you feel like you needed to touch on.
I mean, this conversation has really invited me to think about the possibility of the fact that there is actually still so much more we haven't talked about. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity that we've had to at least begin having some of these conversations over here. I think it's really interesting to kind of look at what's going on right now in Kashmir. where we know, of course, that last week, an attack that was carried out in a part of the valley called Pahalgam resulted eventually in, like India taking very drastic actions, suspending the Indus Waters Treaty, which at some point, I would like to elaborate on maybe in another conversation. Um, and I think it's really interesting. The reason I mentioned that this is interesting is, of course, because a few months ago, in February, I think, um, the Indian media really played up the fact that Hamas representatives were present at a Solidarity Day event in Azad Kashmir, and part of the narrative around that was the fact that Hamas were like involved with training like Kashmiri Mujahideen or whatever, and that they were expecting that there would be a summer of mayhem to come. And I guess that summer of mayhem has arrived. But this foreshadowing strikes me as being really bizarre, to say the
It is.
least. But also completely consistent with India's like historical, and at least in the last few decades, attempts to like build their own discourse of there being like a global movement against like civilization, right, which would include in their case India and the West. That kind of revolves around like armed outfits in Palestine, armed outfits in Kashmir and in Pakistan. And so I just kind of would invite a lot of people to kind of observe what's going on these days with a lot of attention to kind of like the politics of the genocide in Palestine as well. So, for example, like the question of water, the question of this narrative around terrorism, and a certain type of internationalist narrative that India and Israel try to push regarding armed resistance in kind of like their respective zones. And I think, yeah, I think this is a good kind of like invitation to end on, without kind of going much more deeply into.
And we will definitely bring you back to talk about various other issues, Abdullah. I noticed that when I mean other issues related to the subject and other subjects, but I found it interesting that when India kind of launched its war on Kashmir and Pakistani territories, the language that they have used, they
Very
didn't
much
say they did.
resembles. Yeah,
It's very, very much similar. We are
yeah.
not striking, even though they struck civilian positions, they made the
Mhm.
claim that they are hitting terrorist targets and so forth.
Yeah, I mean,
And
I
and
think
that
they use
allows
this. People
Western
speak of
media.
non-military targets, but they didn't explicitly say civilians. And
Exactly.
very significantly, for example, like I think in the last day or two, we heard that 10 members of Masood Azhar's family had been killed by India. And I think this really resembles kind of like Israel's policy of trying to kill the family members of like targets in Gaza.
Which really is terrifying considering the
Mhm.
scope of the genocide. I mean, we are looking at nearly 10% of the population of Gaza that has been either killed, wounded, missing, plus many more who are not being reported in these numbers, who are dying as a result of starvation
Yeah.
and easily curable diseases and all of that. If India, considering the size of the countries and the population of both India and Pakistan, began
Mhm.
kind of applying that kind of logic, it is absolutely terrifying.
Yeah,
Also
it would be
considering that
absolutely
it's a nuclear
catastrophic.
power and so forth. But we will have to stop here. Abdullah,
Yes.
thank you very much for
Thank you
sharing your
so much.
insightful perspectives with us today, and we wish you the very best in your studies, research, and career.
Thank you
Uh,
so
to
much.
our audience, thank you for tuning in. As many of you know, direct engagement is very crucial. So please like, share, comment, and follow to support our work. And we look forward to our next episode of The Floodgate. Thank you.